Welcome everyone to the continuing Lincoln's Unfinished Work Conference.
You're far too important to be kept within the circle of professional historians, and she has been tireless in presenting the best scholarly work to as wide an audience as possible. And in terms of standing on shoulders who have come before us, Heather's topic tonight is the significance of the West in American history, which I think will sound very familiar to lots of American historians. Let me just, I'd like to make, there are so many thank yous to offer for this conference, and I'm not going to belabor this by all of the people in College of Art, Architecture, Arts, and Humanities, or the graduate students who have helped us and been so generous. All of the presenters who have been wonderful, and let me just give a blanket thank you to everyone and anyone I failed to mention. The two people I would like to thank are Vernon and Georgianne. We have debated at some length what is the nature of Lincoln's unfinished work, but there's no question about what Vernon's unfinished work has been and always will be. Born a poor boy in Jim Crow, South Carolina, he has dedicated his career as citizen historian to removing the shackles of racial injustice, economic and class injustice, and every form of inequality from his native state and his nation. And he has believed with a burning passion that as a historian, the truth about the American past, uncomfortable as it may be at times, can only set us free. And Georgianne Burton, who shares Vernon's vision, has been in every way as vital to the success of this conference as her husband. Working so closely with them over the past year, agonizing with them over every detail, I have received a glimpse of what an unusual and remarkable life partnership they share. This conference is all about passing on our unfinished work to those who take it up when we are no longer able to do so. From the high school students who have been a big part of the conference to the workshop for teachers that will follow the luncheon to Vernon and Georgianne's children and grandchildren who have been with us, this conference has been as much about the responsibility of historians for the future as their responsibility to the past. And Lincoln's unfinished work and all of our our most important work will always be unfinished. Thank you, and apologize for this long introduction, and Heather, the floor is yours.
I too would like to thank Peter for being here, and of course Vernon, but I want to say something special about Georgianne, because I think all of us recognize that one of the reasons that this feels more like a family reunion than it feels like a conference is because for decades Georgianne has taken the sharp edges off what can be a very harsh profession. And well, when Vernon asks at least me to jump, I say yes. When Georgianne asks me to jump, I say how high. And that is not without its professional as well as its personal attributes, because my first meeting with Georgianne, and there we go, now I'm suddenly definitely mic'd, was when I met her in the dark at a conference at probably the SHA, and I admired a pin that she was wearing, and she took it off and gave it to me. And I was shocked. I was just out of graduate school. And she said, it's a fundraiser for a domestic abuse shelter. So I went home and thought, well, I'm going to pay it forward, and I started reading about domestic abuse, and that was actually the beginning of my search for the importance of language in constructing power. So this stuff has paid forward, and that's some of what you're going to be hearing about today. So anyway, thanks to Peter and thanks to Vernon, and thank you, Georgianne, if you can hear me, for being such a wonderful addition and mentor to so many of us in the profession for so many years. We could not have done it without you. All right, so I've been interested in these papers in this conference because, of course, I study politics and ideology, and there has been a surprising to me lack of talk about the actual boots-on-the-ground politics and about ideas, about how ideas affect politics. So what I want to talk about today is the relationship between politics and ideas, and to argue that Lincoln's major unfinished work was his political vision for this country. And I would like to point out here that he told us what his work was. 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. We're engaged in a war about that, of course. And then he says, it is for us to be here dedicated to that great task remaining before us, that we here highly resolve that that nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from this earth. Well, what's he talking about? This, of course, is pretty common knowledge at this point. He is reacting to the rise of the slave power and the concept of a different concept of what America should be, and that's the concept that, in fact, there is no such thing as equality and that some people are simply better than others, and those are the people who should be in charge of the government. And, of course, oh, I thought she was going to tell us she couldn't hear us. And of course, the person who is Lincoln's great foil in 1858 and 1859 is James Henry Hammond, who is famous for such lines as, "I repudiate as ridiculously absurd that much lauded but nowhere accredited dogma of Mr. Jefferson that all men are created equal." In fact, as we all know, James Henry Hammond had a different vision of American society. He argued that, in fact, societies were made up of the majority of human beings were drudges. They were stupid, they were loyal, they didn't know how to work, they liked to dance, but that they really couldn't manage their own affairs. They needed to be directed by their betters. And that great vast majority of human beings made up the mudsill of society, literally the pieces of wood that were driven into the mud on which the higher edifices of a building would stand. And he said society was the same way, that the drudges are at the bottom, and real civilization, people like him, stood on that. They were the ones who directed society. They were the ones favored by God. They were the rich ones. They were the ones with education. They were the ones with family connections across across Europe. They were the important people to make sure society moved forward. And it was imperative that you did not let that mudsill vote. They could not have a political voice, because if you gave them a political voice, they would want more of the things they were producing. They were responsible for producing stuff, but they should not be responsible for deciding how that stuff would be spent. If you let them have access to the ballot box, they would use their power to take what they had produced and to waste it in stuff like food and shelter, as opposed to concentrating it in ways that would do more for more people. And of course, this is the principle on which the Confederacy is founded. Andrew Stevens is quite clear about the fact that he is rejecting the concept of equality, that in fact, what the Confederacy is all about is creating a new kind of a progressive kind of society. He believes this is not a retrograde, but rather a progression into a new kind of society that is based on the idea that some people are just better than others. And those people are, of course, wealthy white men who own other human beings. Lincoln is horrified by this. He says, no, that's not what the country is about. Lincoln, of course, is a man who's risen from dirt poverty on his own to become quite a prominent railroad lawyer. And he says, no, that's not what America's about. America is about guaranteeing equality of opportunity, equality of access to resources for everybody according to their ability, not equality of outcome, but equality of opportunity. And he explains a different vision of the world. He says, the world isn't built by the guys at the top. The world is built by the guys at the bottom, people like me who are innovative and who are hardworking and who look at the world in new ways and who create wealth. And that wealth, they will create more than they're able to use, and it will move upward, and it will support the next level of society, the shopkeepers and the small business people. And eventually it'll go to the top where there'll be a few big guys who will in turn employ people at the bottom. It's, as a student of mine once said, kind of like a pyramid scheme. But the idea was that the real wealth of society comes from the bottom. Well, what happens, of course, is when Lincoln is elected to the presidency in 1860, the people who believe that society should be directed by a few rich guys at the top take their marbles and go home. And they leave Lincoln and his Republican Party in charge of the federal government. And I always love these images of the Capitol building under construction because the Congress quite deliberately continued to fund the building of the Capitol during the war, recognizing that it was symbolic, that they were building a new government. And that new government divorced the American government from the slaveholders who had dominated it before the Civil War. Those slaveholders had quite deliberately kept it small. They did not want the federal government to expend money that they would have to pay for any kind of internal improvements or education or anything. They were quite happy to expand the federal government to protect their own interests. And that would be to protect the institution of slavery and to protect their access to resources that not everybody else could get. So they were willing to use the federal government, but only in a special way. The Republicans say, no, 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 no. We're going to take the federal government and we're going to make it a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And of course, they do a number of things to do that. In order to raise money for the Union to fight the war, they have to do a lot of things they don't expect to do. They create our first national money. They create our first national banking system. They create a tariff system that protects that raises tariff levies to about 47% of a good's value. The average rate is about 47%. They also create our first national taxation so that there's a 5%, the beginning of 5% tax on manufacturing, which it is not a sales tax. Kevin Wright is here, but let's pretend it's a sales tax and let him cover his ears because that's how it operates. Everybody ends up paying it. They create the IRS in 1862. It's not called that, but it is the precursor to the IRS. And they create our first national income tax, a graduated income tax that has rates at 5% for people who make between $600,000 and $5,000, 7.5% up to $10,000. And 10% for incomes more than $10,000. So you have here an activist government that puts the weight of the federal finances on the people as opposed to on bankers for the first time in American history. But it does more than that. It decides that if in fact you're going to be sucking money out of people, you got to make them able to make money. So it creates an activist federal state that is designed to promote equality of access to opportunity for guys at the bottom. We get the Homestead Act, which gives 160 acres of land to anybody willing to live on it for 5 years. They create the Department of Agriculture to give regular guys access to good seeds, and they're not going to have it handed down from their fathers. It creates our first national system of education, with the Land Grant College Act in 1862, the Morrill Act, which gives us our state colleges, and it gives us finally in 1862 and 1864 the extraordinary expansion of government power that gives the government the power to charter a corporation, which is designed to get men out to the West, both to mine and to farm and to link California, of course. And in 1864, we get the contract labor law, which gets a bad rap later on, but in 64, it's designed to enable immigrants to borrow against future homesteads in order to fund their travel to America because the Republican Party is desperate for immigrants. I like that piece. They, of course, also do the obvious, which is to guarantee that all men, and I'm only talking about men today because I only have a half an hour. So, but there's a different story, not a different story, a broader story here that includes women, of course, as well. They try to make certain that African American men have access to the same kind of resources and the same access to resources, not the same kind of resources, access to resources, and have the same ability to rise that white men do, and they do that, of course, with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. That matters politically because what I just told you was that the government creates national taxation and an expanded government that help people at the bottom, including people of color, for the first time in American history, and they do it within 5 years of each other. These two things come out of the Civil War, both expanded taxation and a stronger government, and a much more active government that for the first time helps men of color. And this is where we get that bizarre American construction, that an activist government is in fact redistributing wealth from white people to black people. Because that taxation that is, for example, funding the Freedmen's Bureau officers in the South is being paid for by white tax dollars. I've written about this at length before. You guys all know this story, how it is actually on arguments about taxation that the Southern redeemers, who are redeeming the South from corrupt government, that they say, how that's the language with which they begin to take back the South. That's not what I'm going to talk about today. What I want to talk about today is Lincoln's vision of government, the idea of a government for the people, a democracy versus the idea of government for the very wealthy, an oligarchy. It looks by the end of 1865 as if democracy is won, right? The Civil War has decided that the very popular Republican government is in fact the right government for the people. It promotes equality as opposed to oligarchy that the Southern slave owners had defended. But at that very moment, Americans moved west. And this matters a lot. Before the Civil War, the West, the American West, and I'll describe what I mean by that in a minute, but the TransMississippi West was largely small T territory, undeveloped territory. And during the war, the Republicans worked very, very quickly to bring those territories into the United States government, under the rubric of the United States government. The Confederacy tried to do so too, as you know, it failed. But by the end of the war, within 5 years, you've gone from that small T territory region to something that looks very much like America today, with the exception of the fact Dakota Territory has not been broken in two yet, which is going to happen in 1889, and Wyoming has not yet been broken off. This matters because they are organizing this new West in a region that has a really different history than the American East. And what I would like to argue is that the ideology of the Confederacy, the idea of a few guys, rich guys, white guys, being better than everybody else, grafts quite naturally onto this American West, and it finds a new home out there, and that's going to matter politically. This land is, of course, has a long history before the arrival of Americans, and by Americans I'm going to use that word to mean people who come under the purview of the American government. And I want to do that because I don't want to use race-based qualifiers for this particular discussion. This land has been Spanish and it's been Mexican. It's obviously primarily been Indian for history, but it has in it a number of racially based distinctions. This is, of course, a land of Indian slavery and a land of enslavement of Indians by Euro-Americans. By Europeans and then by Euro-Americans. And it is a land in which Americans have arrived where the initial image of the American Westerner, a man like Kit Carson, for example, is a trailblazer. He is also famous for his Indian killing. This is one of the things that makes Kit Carson very important. He is the early symbol of white male domination of others. It's a power description. And after, I'm going to rush through a lot of this because I think Steve covered a bunch of it this morning, but also because I'm actually going somewhere a little bit further than this. This is also a region characterized after 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo by lynching in a huge way. Mexican lynching jumps off the charts. Between 1848 and 1860, there are at least 163 Mexicans lynched in this area. In California alone, they are being called filthy, ignorant, and vicious. This is also a land where there have early been distinctions between miners of different kinds. Indian miners quickly are dispossessed of their lands by Americans moving west. Mexican miners the same, and then obviously the Chinese miners about whom most of us know. Actually, the Mexican and the Chinese miners in 1862 both of them are the drivers behind the foreign miners tax of 1852, which distinguishes by race in the California legal code, which builds on the California Enabling Law of 1850, which permits citizenship only to free white persons, which is based on an immigration law from 1802 made, of course, to say that African Americans or imported slaves could not become citizens. That's applied in the West, and it's going to be applied in the West throughout the 19th century and into the 20th when it's going to be built on. By 1854, of course, we have the Chinese court case which says that Chinese cannot testify in court against a white man. We also have in this period the growing image of others as dangerous to society, personified best, I think, by Juan Cortina, who's known as the Red Robber of the Rio Grande, who begins to fight back when the legal code takes so much Mexican land away from Mexicans against the terms of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So into this region, you have this region with this different history, but the Civil War itself reinforced these things, primarily with two major massacres, the Santee execution after the Dakota War of 1862, which remains the largest mass execution in American history. This is really important in 1862 for a number of reasons, but primarily for my purposes today because this is the first time that Eastern Americans have come in contact with Northwestern Plains Indians. It's different in the Southwest, but in that region, this is the first time people have articulated what an Indian in the West is to Americans, and newspapers uniformly portray them as brutes, as people who should be exterminated. They strip them of any kind of humanity, which of course is illustrated so powerfully 2 years later in Sand Creek when the bodies of the massacred Cheyenne in Colorado are mutilated in really horrific ways, a dehumanization that is fully in place by 1864. So, into this region, Americans move during the early years of Reconstruction, during the early years of the time when Eastern Democrats who hate the concept of Reconstruction are arguing that the government, the federal government, is being used to redistribute wealth from white people to black people. And what do they get out of this? They get a new image of America. They get the image of the American cowboy. And the American cowboy historically is very different than what I'm going to describe here. A third of American cowboys were people of color, of course. They were essentially wage workers. You know the whole story. But they symbolize a government that is not corrupted by those mudsills that James Henry Hammond talked about. A government that works for the little guy so he can make it on his own. And that image, I would suggest, depends on all those people of color and women who have been read out of American history in the West, or have been read out of American civilization in the West from the beginning until 1864. All right, no one cares, right? It's 1865. Who cares about the dude on the horse? Because everything's happening in the East. This cultural image is not necessarily all that important, and it might not ever have been important, aside from the water it was carrying in the early years of Reconstruction, had it not been for politics. 1880 is a crucial year in American political history because, of course, it's the year the South goes solidly Democratic. Of course, they don't know that in 1880. What they do know in 1880 is that Garfield wins the election of 1880 by less than 9,000 votes. And most of those electoral votes are very deeply ingrained in the states, in which there's not a lot of wiggle room. A state's either Republican or Democratic, with one exception, and that one exception is the state of California. California had gone Democratic, but only by 144 votes out of more than 60,000 cast. The Republicans recognize that they've got a problem. If they're going to keep on winning, they've got to see if they can break off California, which is being torn apart by fights over Chinese immigration. In 1882, the Western language of oligarchy, that idea that some people are just simply better than others, bleeds back into the Republican Party, and we get the Republicans supporting the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. It doesn't work. As you know, in 1884, Cleveland, the Democrat, wins the White House, and Republicans absolutely panic. They cheat. They steal the 1888 election, an election very dear to my heart. And in order to make sure they can continue to steal elections, what do? They give us 6 new Western states. How are you going to appeal to states in the West? You are going to hammer on that very concept that a few guys are better than others in in American society, and you are going to do so by beginning to appeal to use that image of the American cowboy to appeal to voting for policies that protect that white guy in the West, which fits quite nicely with the fact that the West is in fact not a land of small farmers, but rather a land of big business. The West in the late 19th century, and still to the present actually, has an extractive economy that looks much like the Old South. Mining, cattle, and agribusiness are all extractive industries that depend on one big guy and lots of very poor workers. Lots of very poor workers in the West who are often immigrants and who are largely powerless. They begin to argue as strikes happen in the West in the late 19th century that actual democracy, letting people like the miners in the coal mines or the small cattlemen have a say in their government, is actually not democracy. It's a perversion of government. That in fact real democracy is letting the directors of the West, the big guys, run everything. There's a lot behind this, obviously. And we have, of course, the increasing progress of that idea with this solidifying image of the American individual as a Westerner who is standing against lazy workers, dangerous Indians, and strikers in places like Coeur d'Alene. In this late 19th century, we get the hardening of racial lines and class lines in the West with new Western state constitutions that prohibit interracial marriage, for example. Got a nod to Peggy Pasco on that. That prohibit property ownership by people who are unable to become citizens under that 1802 law, those new laws based in the 1802 laws, and limit rights to testify and create treason clauses that make treason against a state punishable by death, which is designed to hit the Apaches and the Comanches. Of course, on the heels of this, we get the Rock Springs Riot, which kills 28 Chinese, and of course, the Wounded Knee Massacre, about which, for the record, I still have nightmares. This is also the period that enables this celebration of racial distinctions and, to some degree, class distinctions to take back over American society. This is, of course, the period when we get the rise of Confederate monuments again, the celebration of America as an oligarchy as opposed to a democracy. I wanted this to be Ben Tillman, but they don't put up the stupid statue until 1940. Now I've mentioned him, I felt bad I was the only one who hadn't. This gets written into the insular cases. This becomes American law with the insular cases, in which we put in our federal legislation that some people are better than others. We have now unincorporated territories, places that we rule, and yet those people don't have a say, and the idea of non-citizen nationals, the idea that people live in America, but they are not citizens, they are ruled, they cannot have a voice in their society. On the heels of this, we get an interesting development in American society as the West begins to work with the South. And we see this primarily at first, I'm sorry, I missed a step here. Beginning in 1891, the West quite deliberately organizes as, I'm going to go back to this because it's got an important quotation I didn't say. When the West organizes, when the Republicans organize the West, they make a crucial error, and that they don't see that the West is going to organize with the South along financial lines. In 1891, the West and the South organized together to stand against the East. In 1891, we get the organization of a vitally important group that there's virtually no mention of anywhere, and that's the TransMississippi Congress. It's a second Congress that meets for a number of years in which Westerners organize together across party lines to, as they say, convey to our government, to our friends in the East, that we are growing, we are developing, we are increasing in strength, and that the new empire of the West is being consolidated, and we are fast becoming a commercial, political, and intellectual center, and they are going to take over the government of America. And they do, under Teddy Roosevelt. This very important Newlands Act of 1802 illustrates the ability of Westerners and Southerners to act together under this the idea of the Trans-Mississippi Congress, to which TR nods when he signs this bill. The South and the West share an interest in water because the South keeps flooding and the West keeps being too dry. They want water laws, and they want racial laws, the two regions together. And together they are able to push back against Eastern different ideas about the way democracy should be. The Newlands Act I pulled out here because it is, of course, the act that brings water to the West, but it is also passed and supported by Francis G. Newlands, who is also known for being the white supremacist who says quite deliberately that white people are better than what he calls blacks, browns, and yellows, and who actually proceeds to try and repeal the 15th Amendment to make sure those people cannot have a say in their society. I put up this picture as well showing how the South works with the West because, in fact, it is not the Southern Democrats who kill the anti-lynching law passed after, or introduced to Congress after the Tulsa riots of 1921, I'm sorry. It's actually William Borah of Idaho, a progressive Republican from the judiciary who stands against the law because he says it hurts states' rights. The Eastern Republicans get so frustrated with Western Republicans working with the Southern Democrats that they begin to call Western Republicans sons of the wild jackass. Google it. You'll see some references to it. It was a big deal at the time. And this, FDR says, thank God, because I will get them in 1932. And he does. This is where we get the link, the Western Republicans switching to FDR. And we also get the resurrection of the ideology of the Southern Democrats, like James Ford Rhodes and the Dunning School of Reconstruction, re-enshrining the concept of oligarchy in American society. FDR, of course, picks up the West as well as the South, and he ends up fighting the other war, this one, the big one, World War II. And that's significant to this story politically because World War II changes American population dramatically. It moves us all west. Richard Wright says, it's as if the whole country is tipped and all the people are poured west. In that pouring west, it changes America back to the concept of democracy. I always put this up for Robert Greene. If anybody knows him, tell him I did it. I love this image. This image of democracy is one in which both women and people of color, not just African Americans, but all people of color, demand a say in American society. And it looks briefly as if that's going to happen. Famous picture, of course, from the late 1940s in which Superman says, this is a democracy, and the concept of some people being better than others has been reduced to Foghorn Leghorn, who is based on Senator Claghorn, who is a popular caricature of Southern leadership on the radio. However, with this move west and with this expansion of government, we get the ability of certain people who hate the idea of government regulation and taxation, but primarily government regulation, it gives them an opening to fight back against democracy again. We have here, of course, William F. Buckley Jr., Joe McCarthy, and Barry Goldwater, who hate federal regulation, hate taxation, and recognize that they can only kill this very popular government on the same lines that Andrew Johnson killed Reconstruction. The idea that a government that helps people at the bottom is, in fact, redistributing wealth. And they do it quite powerfully. First, after Brown v. Board, William F. Buckley Jr. starts National Review in 1955, the year after Brown v. Board, says, we told you a big government was going to redistribute wealth from you good and white people to those lazy African Americans. And of course, by 1962, with Ole Miss, you have literally people supporting desegregation being tarred as communists. So we have this wonderful photograph from 1970 in North Carolina. This is Klan country, love it or leave it, stand against communism and integration. How do you push this idea? You push this idea with the idea of the American cowboy. In 1959, there were 26 Westerns on American TV. 8 of 1 week's 10 top shows in March of 1959 were Westerns. This really appeals to people who are anti-communist. It really appeals to people who don't like the idea of an activist government that helps people of color, or women, that's going to come later. And this appeals to that great majority, or the great number of people who've moved west. And you see this in 1964 with the Republican Party deliberately holding its convention in the Cow Palace of San Francisco. Barry Goldwater, of course, runs as a cowboy quite deliberately and takes only his home state of Arizona and the deep southern states, it is worth remembering that the state that puts Barry Goldwater over the top to get the 64 nomination is South Carolina. Very deliberately done. This is their boy. This is the West and the South working together to return America from democracy to a government that speaks only for the very wealthy. Not an accident that Ronald Reagan sold himself as a cowboy, which was a bit of a misnomer, to be honest. He was a very good horseman, but he rode English style until he decided to run for president. And of course, George Bush, it was a stretch no matter how you tried it. But they did try it, and of course, we know that this was deeply linked to Nixon's Southern strategy, which he gets from Barry Goldwater and from the attempt to keep Strom Thurmond and the Dixiecrats and the Republican Party after the shift they made in '64. To make this explicit, Ronald Reagan launched his campaign, of course, as you know, in Mississippi, miles from where civil rights workers had been murdered in '64. He blamed a federal bureaucracy for taking away the American dream, and for white people, obviously, and said, I believe in states' rights. I believe we have distorted the balance of our government by giving powers that were never intended in the Constitution to that federal establishment, echoing, I would argue, people like James Henry Hammond. I just thought I'd put that up there. So what I would like to suggest is that Lincoln's unfinished legacy and the work that, to answer what Randall Kennedy was saying, the answer for what Lincoln's finished legacy would look like is, in fact, a firm commitment to the idea that our government, not just our voters, but our government, should, in fact, be dedicated to government of the people, by the people, and for the people, and that we must guarantee that that does not perish from the earth. Because if we let that happen, if indeed we turn this country over to the oligarchs, over to the people who really do believe they're better than the rest of us, that we have not only killed our own opportunities in the present, but that we will have finally, at long last, decided that a nation so conceived and so dedicated cannot long endure. And that would, in fact, be a complete destruction of Lincoln's ideology and making sure that his work would not survive. The other thing that I would like to add, though, is that I do think this is a turning point in American history for various political reasons, for various voting reasons, but nothing gives me more hope than things like this that happened at the midterms. The inclusion of new voices, especially female voices, in the American government, I suspect may be the trick that means we can finally make Lincoln's vision a reality. Thank you very much. Yes?
I find myself in the really weird position of having to slightly defend James Henry Hammond. Which may be the
Do you really want to go there?
Well, I don't, but
Been in South Carolina too long, Paul.
I have almost a couple of days now, and you know, I'm ready to join the Strom Thurmond Democratic Club. But when Hammond says what he says, and Stevens says what he says, and we both use these quotations all the time, Hammond is, at one level, of course, is saying that all white people, and Stevens is saying the same thing, and in that sense, I think it's not.
I disagree. I disagree. If you look at that entire speech when he says, you people at the North also have mudsills, you just make the mistake of letting them vote.
But he also says that in the South, we have, our entire mudsill is not allowed to vote, and that means black people. That means slaves. And certainly when Stevens says we reject the absurdity of equality for black people,
You know,
I think it's just.
So I just think you, sorry to name drop here, you got to take Carrie Lee Merritt's new book into consideration here. I really do think that you got to take Carrie Lee Merritt's Masterless Men into consideration here. I do think that they're very worried about a poor white class.
Okay. And the other thing I just want to suggest that when you do these pictures next time, you really ought to put the Marlboro Man up there.
I actually usually do the Marlboro Man, but I figured everybody knew my cowboy stuff, so what was the point?
And you need to have Death Valley dates right before Ronald Reagan.
So you know, I grew up without television, so I actually don't know a lot of this stuff.
Well, he was the host of Death Valley Days on TV, and then he brought them to the whole country.
Well, I've never seen them, but
It was this, you know.
it's on Netflix. I'll be good.
It was this Ronald Reagan hosted TV show about the West, Death Valley Days. It's just perfect with Bonanza. That's all.
Oh, come on, you gotta love Haas. Yes.
I don't want to get into a debate, but one of the things that does happen in South Carolina early on is that you had to have to pay taxes or have property to vote. And early on as well, you had to have increasing amounts of property to hold office in South Carolina. So people who were going to be U.S. senators from South Carolina would have to be planters. So there was certainly at least a hierarchy there. But the thing I wanted to get back to the Westerns, because I watched them on TV. I was raised on them as well. But one of the things that I always in the back of my mind when I watch these shows, it's very much like Father Knows Best. It kind of gives us representation that white men can almost single-handedly handle any kind of problem. And Matt Dillon is one of my favorites. He can outshoot anybody. Him and Chuck Connors are like, they never get shot unless from the back. It's done dirty. And I think that that's really part of the problem with the mythology, that's kind of included into our belief system, that the system is being tilted to stop the natural supremacy of white men, which is what this kind of stuff was about.
And yet that itself is a very deliberate construction. And I absolutely think you're right. I think reconceiving of what symbolizes this moment, this whole Western ideological moment. And the other piece of this I think is really important is Star Wars. I mean, Star Wars is a Western. Star Wars is the movie of 1977. What happens in 1978? You know, Proposition 13 in California. And this is what Reagan rises to power on. It's not an accident that he comes 3 years after. We all saw Star Wars like 400 times, right? Yes, Steve?
So it seems to me that, if I'm understanding you right, you're making an argument about the war of oligarchy against democracy in an unholy alliance of South and West with racism, proved bluntly, as the solvent that allows violence to do the work of enforcing that oligarchy.
The piece that I'm not dealing with as much here is there's also the progressive side of that. That's they also link over the water rights and some other rights too. But yes.
But the place I want to push is a little bit is because you're beginning with Lincoln there is the embodiment of the democratic ideal. And it's not fair because you weren't here on Thursday, but I suggested in my paper on Thursday that whatever differences, and they were very significant, they were existentially significant, separated Lincoln and, if not Hammond, and Stevens, or Jefferson Davis especially. They were united over the belief that the United States was going to conquer the West, and it was going to conquer it and take it from its inhabitants. And from that perspective, the violence of Dakota 38, of Sand Creek, of Wounded Knee, are overdetermined, not in the oligarchic vision, but in the democratic vision as well. So I wonder if you can respond to that.
Yeah, I think, yeah. I mean, that's obviously what the Shermans are up to, too, really quite deliberately. Indians stand in the way of this. Although I will say there's a new book coming out on Lincoln and Indians, which I have not read. It's not out yet. So I suppose we should wait on that one, too. But I think, what I am pushing is the power of ideas and the power of language. And that by articulating a vision of democracy, which we have never achieved and probably never will achieve, that he is defining America, and that we are at a moment, and even though he defines it very imperfectly, I mean, he commutes the sentences of a lot of the people who are convicted in the Dakota Wars, but he lets a lot of people go to death who shouldn't, and he knows it, but he's upholding the law. For all that that's imperfect, that vision of self-determination, of democracy and self-determination, for all that it's imperfect and for all that it reads certain people out, and it does, it reads out people of color in the West, it also reads out women across the board for most people. That has within it a principle that is worth preserving. And it does stand quite deliberately against the concept of oligarchy. So for all of the fact that that vision does say it's going to take in the West, it says it's going to take in the West for the little guy. Yeah, the little white guy, maybe the little black guy. But it is a concept of access to resources that is different than the slave owners who are like, no, we get it all. Just like sort of you and me getting a chance rather than Jared Kushner. Catherine.
Well, I'm really intrigued though when we talk about the, changes, the agenda, what I'm thinking about in conjunction with Marcus on the way in which accidentally the West becomes more opportunity, the Moral Act, the Homestead Act, and there are women seizing that opportunity. Clearly, Mormon agendas allow women to get the vote in Utah, et cetera. So it's so fascinating right up to the present, the way in which the unholy alliance between Southerners and Western Republicans leads to these accidents right through to women in the 60s getting benefits. So the Southern congressmen talking to filibuster and women equality with blacks, and wouldn't that be a joke? Which does pass. So, it's also true, I'm wondering if it's not a secret agenda, but do you think that women saw this as an opportunity, that the West was their opportunity?
I mean, I'm hardly the person to speak to you two about the West. I do think that women definitely saw the West as an opportunity because there aren't laws written out there at that point. So it's way easier. I've actually read the Wyoming debates. It's way easier to get legislation for women in the West. But the piece that is not here and comes actually from lots of work in Latin America is, I think there is a piece of this that is environmental. In that both the South and the West were susceptible to economies that revolved around, that were essentially extractive economies. And the East does not have such deliberately extractive economies. And those extractive economies spin everything around them. Every economy spins the history of capital, people who are doing history of capitalism now will say, well, capitalism spins everything around it, but every economy spins everything around it. And that to go back to what Steve was saying, that one of the things I'm arguing is if you spin the whole country around the concept of equality so that religion supports it, culture supports it, society supports it, education supports it, it's very hard then to step outside it and say, oh no, we're actually gonna take everything. But if you spin the entire country around, hey, we're the rich guys, we get everything, the way that happened in the West and the South, that's also very hard to break out of. And that, because religion supports it, society supports it, everything else supports it. So the West, I think, had opportunities because for women, because at first things were not written. But later on, they do something that Marjorie has said is very different when women actually get the vote. Women begin to argue for rights in the West based on their role in this construction of an individualist. They want to be mothers. I mean, they may not want that, but that's the language with which they take on the suffrage. And the concept that maybe women get the vote because people want the government to be more female-oriented is really interesting to me, because I don't think that's the way they're arguing in the West. I think they're arguing for we'll be the wives and the mothers to the cowboys. Not literally, but that kind of spinning idea. Yeah, Peter.
As tended to developing oligarchy in the late 19th century, places the emphasis on the rise of big business in the East, and large corporations, and labor management. I wonder how that fits into the
Well, don't you think it does fit in? If in fact the West is characterized by the rise of these oligarchical railroad industrialists and all that, Stephen Field is working out of California and working for the railroads. Of course, he ends up on the Supreme Court, and you get this moment where at the same time you have the rise of these big business guys. It is part of that. What supports that is this idea of individualism, which helps to promote the destruction of rights for women and people of color across the rest of the country. I think those two things go hand in hand. You cannot have the rise of the people at the top without the squishing of people at the bottom, because that's how they get their support, is by saying those people are worms, we're the ones who should be directing everything. I think they work together, and they work based on imagery.